Hi, everyone. I'm Erica Hill, and today for Kate Baldwin, here's what we're watching at this hour. President Biden on the world stage. A packed schedule for his first trip abroad will lay out what's at stake for the White House. Priorities in peril. As he leaves for Europe, the president's domestic agenda seems to be falling apart. So is Biden's trip coming at the worst possible time? And Dr. Anthony Fauci has led the fight against two of the world's worst epidemics, COVID and AIDS. He'll join us to talk about what worries him with the COVID crisis and his legacy. Right now, President Biden is on his way to England for his first international trip since office, but he leaves behind a domestic agenda stuck in gridlock. He leaves that as he faces the major challenge of bolstering relationships with international allies, and his schedule is jam-packed. 8 days of diplomacy, which will take him from England to Brussels to Geneva, where he'll end with that high-stakes meeting with Vladimir Putin. CNN's Arlette Saenz is in England, where President Biden will soon land. So, Arlette, what do we expect from this first foreign trip for President Biden?
Well, Erica, President Biden has made clear that an overarching message during this trip here to Europe will be ensuring that the U.S. is shoring up its relations with allies, while also putting adversaries like China and Russia on notice. You will see that take place with that high-stakes meeting 1 week from today when the president sits down with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And just a few hours ago, before the president left Washington, D.C., he told reporters what his goals for the trip are. Take a listen.
Strengthening the alliance, make it clear to Putin and to China that Europe and the United States are tight, and the G7 is going to move.
Now, this is a carefully choreographed trip, and at the start, the president will be focusing on those alliances. He will be traveling here to the Cornwall area for that meeting with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as well as the G7 summit over the course of the next few days. This evening, when the president lands, he will be speaking to service members and meeting with service members and their families at Mildenhall Air Base, a little bit closer to London. But while the president is here at the G7 summit, at the top of the agenda, they're expected to focus on things like climate change, countering China, and also COVID-19. At some point over the course of the next few days, the president will be making an announcement when it comes to the global production of the vaccine, as so many countries around the world are still trying to get their hands on vaccinations for their people. Now, after this meeting at the G7, the president meets one-on-one and with the First Lady, with Queen Elizabeth. The Biden will be the 13th American president that Queen Elizabeth has met during her time as Queen of England. Now, the president will also head to Brussels, where he will participate in NATO and EU summits, once again trying to shore up those relationships with allies. And then there is that critical meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin next Wednesday. There had been debate over whether this meeting should actually take place, but the president believing that face-to-face interaction is critical as he is trying to set the course for the relationship with Putin going forward.
Arlette Saenz, the latest for us on that agenda. Arlette, thank you. Joining me now, Max Boot, CNN Global Affairs Analyst. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Max, always good to see you. You know, this reporting that Arlette just mentioned, that there was some debate in the White House about whether this meeting should happen with Vladimir Putin. Do you think it should? Where do you stand?
I think it makes sense. I mean, after all, we had U.S. presidents meeting with leaders of the Soviet Union, even at the height of the Cold War, when we were much more antagonistic than we are today. There's no doubt that Vladimir Putin is an international criminal, but he needs to be called to account. But you still got to be able to have face-to-face conversations with leaders of major countries such as Russia or China, however much you might abhor their conduct. And in fact, talking to the leader of that country like Putin is a way to signal your displeasure face-to-face, while also finding areas where you can work together, for example, on reducing the nuclear arsenals of both powers. So, you know, as long as we don't see the kind of appalling performance that we saw from Trump when he met with Putin in Helsinki, and of course we will not see that. We will not see, Biden paying homage to Putin the way that Trump did. As long as Biden stands up for American interests and levels with Putin, which I'm sure he will do, I think it's a good idea to have the meeting.
Well, he was asked specifically what he's going to say. Here's a little bit of what he just told reporters.
That Putin will be able to work out any kind of understanding with you on the cyber attack.
knows. It's going to be a subject of our discussion.
There's a lot, obviously, that stems on down from the cyber attacks. The president saying it's going to be part of the discussion. How much of a priority should addressing these cyber attacks be for President Biden?
Well, there's no question that the cyber attacks have to be a priority because they've been very damaging to the United States. But there's a whole host of other issues where Russia's actions are also very damaging, in the way that they are continuing their invasion of Ukraine, for example, or the way that they continue to meddle in politics in Europe and the United States, or the way that Putin has backed his ally Lukashenko in Belarus after he hijacked a civilian aircraft to arrest a dissident. So there's a whole range of issues where Russia is essentially an international outlaw regime, and I think Biden needs to lay down the law to Putin and make clear that there will be escalating sanctions and consequences for Russian misconduct.
As we look at this, is a big week, as we've said, for President Biden. It's not just his first overseas trip, but when we look at the administration as a whole, we have Vice President Harris just finishing her first international trip and frankly, being met with criticism on both sides. In fact, our reporting is that within the White House, I want to make sure I get this wording correct, the staff was quietly perplexed about how she answered questions about why she hasn't visited the border with Mexico. What's your take on this first trip for her as vice president?
I think she did fine. She could have handled the questions about the border visit better, but to my mind, it's basically a phony baloney scandal because, you have this right-wing attack machine led by Fox and others, and they need to attack Democrats for something, but they can't lay a glove on Joe Biden because he seems so innocuous and so likable, and so they're looking for somebody else in the Democratic Party to beat up, and Vice President Harris, as a woman of color, is a prime target, and so they've created this pseudo scandal about why hasn't she visited the border? Well, maybe one good reason is she's not in charge of the border. She is not the Secretary of Homeland Security. Her remit from President Biden is to deal with the Central American states and to try to get them to reduce their migration to the United States. And that's what she was doing when she was visiting Guatemala and Mexico. So this notion that she has to go to the border, it's really this Fox News concoction, but they've had enough success blasting it out into the atmosphere that the vice president certainly has to be able to handle those kinds of questions in a better way.
Max Boot, always good to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
As President Biden heads overseas, his agenda here at home appears stalled. Efforts to get a bipartisan infrastructure deal, hopes for a police reform bill, even voting rights efforts, all facing major setbacks. CNN chief congressional correspondent Manu Raju joining us now with the details. So Manu, where do the president's key agenda issues stand at this point?
Well, a lot of them are stalled, and a lot of them are on a knife's edge right now, and this month will determine whether or not he can get much of his agenda through, or whether or not it will fall by the wayside. And at the center of that is a major infrastructure package. We did see those talks be with Senator Shelley Moore Capito abruptly scrapped last night, and I just talked to her moments ago, and she was actually somewhat critical of this new effort, a bipartisan effort to try to get a deal, suggesting it impacted her ability to get a deal, suggested it may have even undercut her as she was trying to get a deal with the White House. Now, what the White House is focusing on is this new bipartisan effort to try to see if there's any sort of consensus around an infrastructure proposal. But in talking to the key negotiators this morning, there's very clear how high of a hurdle it will be to achieve a deal that can get across both sides of the Congress, as well as get support within the Senate Democratic caucus. And for one big reason is because the Senate Republican negotiators are saying that tax increases are completely off the table, and that is what Democrats are demanding to pay for a massive package. What about raising taxes? Are you open to raising taxes?
We're not raising taxes, no. Well, the last thing we want to do in an infrastructure package is to hurt the economy. As we come out of COVID, we want to actually help to keep the economy moving in the right direction. So, yeah, taxes would be a huge mistake.
This is the problem. Republicans always say they want to modernize our infrastructure. They just don't want to pay for a thing.
And that last comment came from Chris Van Hollen. He's not part of the negotiating group, but he represents the view of a number of Senate Democrats who simply will not go along with what the Republicans are talking about, how to pay for this package. That has long been the sticking point on a major infrastructure deal. This bipartisan group is talking about repurposing money that had already been enacted under the massive COVID relief law, some money that has not been spent, certain user fees as well, but there are concerns among the White House about doing just that. So whether they can get a deal and how to pay for it continues to divide the two parties. And in one key Democratic senator who's part of that negotiating group, John Tester, I just spoke to him as well. He did confirm that tax increases is not part of what they're discussing here, but he said he's going to give these bipartisan talks about a week. And if they don't reach a deal, that's when you can expect Democrats in the Senate and the White House to get behind an effort to try to pass the bill along straight party lines through a budget process that can prevent the Senate Republicans from filibustering that. But to do that, you need the support of all 50 Democrats, including those like Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, who are not in line with the Democratic leaders on this point. Erica?
We are going to keep you very busy for the next week, Manu, is what that means. Meantime, there is so much uncertainty surrounding the president's agenda right now. Is this the right time for him to be traveling overseas? What are you hearing in the halls there?
Yeah, you know, some of his negotiators are involved, his aides are involved in some of the negotiations here. They're being kept apprised of what's happening. And one key issue could actually happen in the days ahead, and that's the issue of policing legislation, overhauling police practices in this country. I'm hearing that they are close to a deal that they can announce as soon as next week, including dealing with that key issue about how police officers are treated in civil court and whether victims of police violence can actually go to court in civil court and sue. And I'm hearing they're talking about having to police departments being liable in civil courts. That would be a key compromise if they can really reach. But still, Erica, if a negotiating team can reach a deal, they still got to sell it to Congress, and that is also a high hurdle. Erica.
That it is. Manu, appreciate it. Thank you. Coming up, a rioter seen chasing police through the Capitol building on January 6th says he is not responsible for what he did that day. And now he's asking to be released from jail. Plus, Dr. Fauci joins me live. His warning about a new, highly contagious COVID variant now spreading in the U.S. At this hour, new developments in the investigation into the January 6th insurrection. A man caught on video chasing a police officer through the Capitol building during the riots is now asking a judge to be released from jail. Doug Jensen, who's pictured here wearing a QAnon shirt, says he was misled into taking part in the siege, deceived by a, quote, pack of lies from QAnon and former President Trump. CNN's Whitney Wild is live in Washington with the latest for us. So, Whitney, what is going on here?
Well, Douglas Jensen was among the most visible rioters on January 6th. He's seen on video wearing a QAnon T-shirt pursuing Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman ahead of an angry mob following them up the stairs inside the Capitol. Jensen claims he was misled into joining the deadly insurrection, that he was not part of any mob and simply came to Washington from Des Moines, Iowa to observe the events of the day. He even argues that he felt threatened by Officer Goodman. Jensen is asking to be released from jail until his trial. In a court filing, his attorney writes, Jensen's initial attraction to QAnon was its stated mission to eliminate pedophiles from society. For reasons he does not even understand today, he became a true believer and was convinced he was doing a noble service by becoming a digital soldier for Q. He fell victim to this barrage of internet-sourced info and came to the Capitol at the direction of the President of the United States to demonstrate that he was a true patriot. Prosecutors, Erica, see this very differently. They say as the crowd coalesced into a violent mob, Jensen was among the first people to push his way inside the Capitol. Jensen is just the latest Capitol riot suspect to express remorse and to blame either QAnon or the former president for inciting the violence. So far, the federal judges who are overseeing these Capitol riot cases have not been swayed by this argument. Jensen has been charged with 7 federal crimes, including obstructing congressional proceedings, interfering with police officers, civil disorder. I mean, the list goes on. He has pleaded not guilty. He's been in jail since his arrest in January. There's a hearing scheduled for next week to deal with his continued detention, Erica. But there are a lot of defendants who are trying to say, look, they're the victims here, and he's one of them.
Whitney Wild, great reporting as always. Thank you. Joining me now, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger. She's a Democrat from Virginia. Good to have you with us. You know, if we pick up on January 6th, where we just left off with Whitney there, the Senate report, which came out on January 6th, I know you said highlighted that we did learn about some of the failures in terms of intelligence communication and security failures at the Capitol. We didn't, though, learn about the root causes there. No mention of former President Trump. And we know this bipartisan attempt to learn more about what happened leading up to January 6th and on that day just failed in the Senate. I mean, is it your sense now that this ship has sailed, some sort of a bipartisan effort or even a real desire to learn about what happened?
Erica, I don't think that's an acceptable option. We have a circumstance, and I was in the Capitol on January 6th. I was in the House chamber when we had to lock down the doors, get down. I was there as I watched police officers put benches and tables in front of the doors trying to stop the insurrectionists from being able to break through the doors. This was a serious assault on our democracy. More than 140 police officers were brutalized, losing fingers, losing eyes. We saw deaths on that day, and there were people who, as they say, as mentioned in your prior reporting, were focused on digesting a pack of lies and came to Washington, as they say, at the urging of former President Trump, attempting to stop Congress from doing its duty. And so while it's important that we saw the first report and this report about the actual failures that occurred on that day of January 6th in terms of an operational failure to keep the building secure, what's really important is understanding how we got to January 6th in the first place. It's important to know that the intelligence wasn't passed to all the people it needed to be passed to. But when there's intelligence saying that there are American citizens who plan on marching on the Capitol, they think they're doing it because they believe the president wants them to do it, and they plan on stopping Congress, and they plan on terrorizing lawmakers, we need to understand what got our country to that point. I mean, frankly, Erica, it's if your roof collapses and someone says, well, there was structural damage. Well, of course, there's structural damage, but we need to know why that structural damage was there so that we can prepare and ensure it never happens again. And this is the very structure of our democracy. So it's incredibly important that we understand the root causes that got us to that day.
So how do you do that? What in your eyes would be the best path? And is there a bipartisan path to do that? Because as we know, if it's not bipartisan, it's going to be viewed in that light.
Yeah. I mean, arguably, it has to be nonpartisan, or it has to be bipartisan in terms of who's coming to the table. But everyone sitting at that table doing the review of what led us to that point has to be committed to taking party out of it. It isn't what happened to Democrats or to Republicans. It's about what happened to the American people and the American democracy. So certainly there are ongoing discussions about potentially a presidential commission. There's ongoing discussions about a congressional select committee. If there's a select committee, for it to have the real the power that it would need, it has to be bipartisan, and it has to be bipartisan in that it's not a group of Democrats talking to a group of Republicans. It's a group of Americans who represent a broad array of political philosophy, perhaps, but united in their desire to truly understand what led our country to such an unthinkable event that we would see our fellow citizens conducting an insurrection, beating police officers, and walking through the halls of the United States Capitol screaming, "Hang Mike Pence."
We will be watching and seeing what happens there. I do want to get you on infrastructure as well. You're part of the Problem Solvers Caucus, and we know you've just put out your own proposal, $1.25 trillion, I believe. The big question, though, and the big sticking point, as we know, is how to pay for this. How do you pay for that? That's what we need, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Erica, those conversations are still ongoing. I think, many people across Capitol Hill have been of the opinion that we have to first agree upon what it is that we are actually wanting to fund, and then have the next discussion of how we pay for it. Certainly, I align with many of my colleagues, which say that we have to, recognize the real need of paying for these major investments. And frankly, we are looking at making record investments in American infrastructure in our nation. And so I don't think that there's a need for us to rush through this process. We should be focused and determined and informed by the president's proposal, certainly the American Jobs Plan, which is physical infrastructure, and more expansive elements of our social infrastructure. And we should really drill down on what it is that we are putting forth in terms of the investments we're making, and from there continue the conversations about how to pay for it. So those conversations are ongoing. As you might imagine, a lot of people have a lot of opinions, and we're working through them, really trying to come up with agreements that are going to be productive and useful and helpful to the Biden administration as we move forward.
So I have 10 seconds. So what you're saying is no timeline.
Currently, ideally, the first step was agreeing to what we wanted to pay for, and now the second step is agreeing to how to pay for it. So, all right, I would say, thoughtful, purposeful legislating doesn't always need to have a fixed timeline.
Fair enough. Well, we look forward to the updates when they come. Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, thanks for your time today. Thank
you so much.
Just ahead, Dr. Fauci joins me live, focusing on COVID and AIDS. He's led the fight against both of these deadly diseases. Some progress, still some major concerns on both. When it's time to taxes, new reporting from ProPublica says the nation's top 25 richest people pay little to nothing at all. The revelation after an anonymous source sent the publication years of tax returns from thousands of the wealthiest Americans, among them Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk. CNN chief business correspondent Christine Romans reports.
When it's time to pay taxes, new reporting from ProPublica says the nation's top 25 richest people pay little to nothing at all. The revelation after an anonymous source sent the publication years of tax returns from thousands of the wealthiest Americans, including Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk.
We had to work for months on this to get it into a shape where we, were satisfied that it was accurate and it was saying something clear.
Take a look at Amazon founder and CEO Bezos. According to ProPublica's reporting, back in 2007, his wealth increased $3.8 billion and paid nothing in federal income taxes. Neither did Tesla founder Elon Musk in 2018, and not a penny from George Soros for the 3 years between 2016 and 2018. And it's all legal, thanks to U.S. tax codes, which focus more on wages as opposed to investments, which are usually taxed at lower rates. That's something billionaires like Bezos can take advantage of, along with complicated tax loopholes and write-offs. ProPublica says while the now richest man in the world's wealth grew $99 billion between 2014 and 2018, he only paid $973 million in taxes at a rate of less than 1%.
So if you are Jeff Bezos and you're sitting atop this wealth and you're getting richer by the day, that doesn't get transformed into income. You don't have to put that on your tax return until you sell your stock generally.
And for Buffett, who has said in the past he favors raising taxes for the rich, his wealth grew by $24 billion between 2014 and 2018, and the amount of taxes paid, $23.7 million, or just 0.1% of his wealth. Buffett telling ProPublica tax codes should be changed substantially, and huge dynastic wealth is not desirable for our society. According to ProPublica's analysis, the 25 richest Americans were worth $1.1 trillion by the end of 2018. It would take 14.3 million ordinary American wage earners to make that same amount of wealth. The IRS and the FBI are now investigating this leak, and the Biden administration says it's looking into the situation.
Any unauthorized disclosure of confidential government information by a person with access is illegal, and we take this very seriously.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki also emphasized President Biden's proposal to raise taxes on the wealthy to help finance his spending plans.
We know that there is more to be done to ensure that corporations, individuals who are at the highest income are paying more of their fair share.
No comment to ProPublica from Bezos or Musk. Musk replied to the nonprofit publication with a question mark, but didn't reply to detailed questions. A spokesperson for Soros telling ProPublica between 2016 and 2018, George Soros lost money on his investments and therefore didn't owe federal income taxes in those years. Mr. Soros has long supported higher taxes for wealthy Americans. Up next, two threats, AIDS and COVID, one doctor on the front lines fighting both. Up next, Dr. Anthony Fauci discusses both those battles with me and why the new Delta variant is such a threat to the progress being made against COVID. Right now, by practically every metric, the U.S. is doing really well in the fight against COVID. The country saw an average of fewer than 14,400 daily infections and 427 daily deaths over the last 7 days. That's according to data from Johns Hopkins University. Those are the lowest figures since late March of 2020. Some 42% of Americans are now fully vaccinated. Nearly 52% of the population has received at least one dose of the vaccine, according to the CDC. But there are threats that can't be ignored. One of those, the highly contagious Delta variant. Joining me now with more is Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and President Biden's chief medical advisor. Dr. Fauci, always good to have you with us. When we talk about this Delta variant, I know you are especially concerned about it based on what you're seeing happening in the UK. This Delta variant is the one that was first identified in India, and it's here. We know it's here in the US. It's peaking among young people, you said, in the UK. What is it right now that has you most concerned about its impact on the US?
Well, the issue is that even though we're doing very well by the numbers that you mentioned, Erica, which are quite true, that the numbers of cases are coming down, the vaccinations have gone up, we've done very well with vaccination, we cannot declare victory prematurely because there are still a substantial proportion of people who have not been vaccinated. And the situation in the UK is that they had as the dominant variant, the Alpha, the B117. The Delta variant, the one you just mentioned that was particularly problematic in India, the 617, has taken over as the dominant infection in the UK. About 60% now are having this particular variant, and it's been predominant among young individuals from 12 to 20. That variant is here in the United States. The data that we have from the UK study is that the vaccines that are used, particularly the mRNA vaccines that are used here in the United States, but also likely the J&J too, but we have more data with the mRNA, are doing very well in being able to protect against the 617, a slight to modest diminution, but nothing significant, which means that since this variant is here, about 6% of the isolates in the United States are this troublesome variant. You don't want to give it the opportunity to take over as the dominant variant. And we have within our power to do that by getting people vaccinated because we have very, very good vaccines. And that's the reason why I've been saying we don't want to let happen in the United States what is happening currently in the UK, where you have a troublesome variant essentially taking over as the dominant variant, which has made it a very difficult situation in the UK. We don't want to be there. We want to prevent that. And the way you prevent it is by continuing to get people vaccinated and not declare victory before we're there.
You know, there are a couple points on vaccinations. I know there's a real focus on this 70% of adults with at least one dose by July 4th. You said yesterday that's not the end date, as vaccinations are slowing. There's some concern, though, what we're seeing when it comes to these J&J doses that are set to, expire, not be used. Is there anything that can be done at this point to move those around, to make sure that they're not wasted, whether it's going to other states or even other countries, maybe Canada?
Well, the FDA is looking into that right now, trying to determine if, in fact, the date can be extended or not. And if so, can we get them properly utilized, whether it's utilized in the United States or elsewhere, just as you say. But this is something that the FDA is very much on and looking at it very, very carefully.
Real quickly, before we move on to AIDS, because I do want to talk to you about that 40 years of your work. As we're waiting for kids 11 and under, as they're waiting for the vaccine, in a conversation with a colleague this morning, we were talking about the fact that kids are different sizes, right? If you give a child Tylenol, you look at not just their age, but their weight. How much does that come into play? I say this as the mother of an 11-year-old who some days could be mistaken for a 12 or a 13-year-old.
Right. So when you do studies in children, you do what's called both an age de-escalation and a dose de-escalation study. So that when you have children, you go from maybe 12 to 9, 9 to 6, 6 to 2, and then 6 months to 2 years. But also when you get down to the low ones, as we've seen with Pfizer, they're dealing with a dose that's considerably less. They started off with 30, they're going down to 10, and then maybe even 3 micrograms in the very, very young children. So there is a dose de-escalation. So by the time we get to the late fall and possibly early winter, when we can have enough information to vaccinate children of any age, you will know that the dose will be suited to the age and size of the child. So you're not going to give a very young child the same dose you would give an adult.
It's great information for so many parents. For the last 40 years, so we just marked the anniversary of the first case of what is now known as AIDS here in the U.S. 40 years ago, it was identified. You have dedicated so much of your career, and I would venture to say so much of what you've invested personally, because I know how important this fight has been for you. As you look back at the last 40 years and where we are today, is this where you thought we would be in the fight against AIDS?
In some respects, yes, and in some respects, no. Because as you have any kind of an outbreak, as it evolves, you learn things that you did not know in the beginning. So, it's been an extraordinary journey. I happen to be one of the few people who are still around, active, who are actually there from the very first days. I remember it so clearly, the first 5 cases from Los Angeles, curiously, of gay men. We didn't know what it was. Some of us thought it was a fluke. And then a month later, in July of '81, when we had the 26 cases, now again, curiously, all gay men, not only with a strange pneumonia, but with other opportunistic infections and a strange cancer called Kaposi sarcoma, that we knew we were dealing with a brand new infection. It transformed and changed my entire career and my entire life. But from that, we went to the early years, which was dark years, Erica, where you took care of people. You had no intervention because we didn't even know what the cause of this was. Then when we found the cause, we were able to do research to start developing drugs. And for the first few years, when you had no drugs and then 1 drug and 2 drug, and then finally, when we had the combination of drugs, several years later, 1996, when we had the transformation of the treatment of persons with HIV. And we went from something that was my dark years and the dark years of so many of us, where all of our patients died, to spectacularly successful therapy. So in the arena of therapy, it has been an amazing success story, not only in the treatment of persons with HIV, but in the prevention by pre-exposure prophylaxis, which has been very challenging, has been a vaccine, because the body doesn't make a very good immune response against HIV. And for that reason, it's been very, very difficult to develop a safe and effective vaccine. And that's the remaining scientific challenge. But there's another challenge we have with HIV, and that is the implementation of the tools that we already have. We have spectacular therapy, very good pre-exposure prophylaxis. We've got to get that equitably implemented in this country and worldwide. The PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, started by President George W. Bush, was a major step, together with the Global Fund, in getting some degree of equity globally by getting people in the developing world to have access to therapy. So there have been some spectacular successes, but still some challenges ahead.